Bill 2279, Madam Secretary.
Senate Bill 2279, a bill for an act to amend and reenact Sections 14, Sections 26 of the North Dakota Century Code relating to prohibition of discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation.
Senator Hogue.
Mr. President, Senate Bill 2279 is a proposal to amend our Human Rights Act to expand the class of persons who would be able to bring a civil lawsuit or an administrative complaint before the North Dakota Department of Labor. And it does so by including within the protected classes individuals based on their sexual orientation. Your committee heard this bill for almost a full day of testimony, Mr. President. We realize that it arouses strong passions on both sides of the issue, and it's essentially the same bill that we heard last session. So I fully expect that a lot of people know where they're probably at on this bill, but I thought it would be useful for the full Senate to go through the bill and to go through the testimony and the policy for and against the proposal. First of all, the Human Rights Act is two chapters in our North Dakota Century Code. The first chapter relates to discrimination based on public accommodations, employment, and credit decisions. And there's a second chapter that relates to housing decisions. But what both chapters essentially do is direct both the government and private individuals that you may not make employment decisions, you may not make housing decisions, public accommodation decisions, credit decisions based on a person's race, based on a person's gender, based on a person's age, with certain exceptions, of course. And what this bill would do is add sexual orientation. Now, Mr. President, it's in understanding the substance of the bill, it's important to look at two definitions, and the definitions are found on pages 3 and 4 of the bill. And the first definition is the definition sexual orientation. That means actual or perceived heterosexuality, bisexuality, homosexuality, or gender identity. And then gender identity on the bottom of page 4 is itself a defined term. That's on page 3, lines 22 through 24. So we have a definition within a definition here. Gender identity means actual or perceived gender-related identity, appearance, or mannerisms, or other gender-related characteristics of an individual, regardless of the individual's designated gender at birth. And so that's really the important part of the bill in terms of understanding it. Those would be the individuals if you are either regardless of your sexual orientation or the perception of your sexual orientation or gender identity, you would be the people in the class that could bring the civil lawsuits or the administrative complaints asserting that you were discriminated on those bases. We heard initially from the proponents of the bill, the due pass witnesses, and I would say a fair summary of their testimony is that they said this is sort of a natural extension and completion of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And I don't think the majority of the committee, it's a 4-2 do not pass, Mr. President. I don't think the majority of the committee accepted that, especially with respect to public accommodations. If we go back historically, we know that both the private sector and the government condoned discrimination on the basis of race. We had separate schools for blacks and whites. We had separate drinking fountains. We had separate buses. Or at least people had, for public transportation, the African Americans had to go to the back of the bus. We also had the same level of discrimination by the private sector. The private sector held out hotel rooms for certain races and excluded others from those hotel rooms. Well, for the majority, Mr. President, that just didn't seem like that was an accurate representation of what is happening today. We don't see people being discriminated with respect to public accommodations based on their sexual orientation. So we didn't. I don't think we accepted the idea that it's a analogous to the civil rights movement. We also looked at government discrimination, because we know from the Civil Rights Act that the government did condone discrimination. And certainly that's probably true with respect to sexual orientation. Until several years ago, we know that our U.S. Armed Forces explicitly discriminated against members of their ranks because of their sexual orientation. In fact, Mr. President, I remember the regulations specifically said that homosexuality is incompatible with service in the armed forces. We know that policy has changed. We know that gay men and women can openly serve in our armed forces. That barrier having been eliminated, the committee, at least a majority of the committee recommending a do not pass, could not find that level of discrimination in North Dakota. We didn't have any witnesses come forward to say that they were discriminated on the basis of their sexual orientation, either by the government or by the private sector. The next argument that was advanced, Mr. President, by the proponents of the bill is it really is a question of communicating with the gay and lesbian community that North Dakota welcomes them, embraces them, and doesn't want them to move out of state, because that seemed to be a common theme, is that North Dakota is outwardly hostile to gay and lesbian residents. And again, Mr. President, I don't think the majority on the committee accepted that notion. We heard testimony that the gay population, at least in North Dakota, was between 1.5 to 1.7%, and there was a higher percentage, but the truth of the matter is nobody really knows. And so I think the majority, Mr. President, felt that there's no policy in the state of North Dakota, there's no culture that is suggesting that young gay men and young gay women should move outside of the state. I think there was recognition that if you make up 1.5% of the population and you desire to have a life partner, you're going to have to go to communities that have higher populations. And so the sparsely populated areas of North Dakota is not especially welcoming to gay men and gay women, because they don't have very many partners to choose from. It's just a simple math. So, Mr. President, the majority did not accept the idea that this is a hostile community or state for gay men and gay women. So, Mr. President, I think that summarizes the testimony. I think if we could say the bottom line from the majority that advocates for a do not pass on the bill is that we really did not see a problem. At least the problem was never defined to us in terms of either explicit discrimination or even implicit discrimination. And so that is why, Mr. President, your Judiciary Committee on a vote of 4-2 recommends a do not pass on Senate Bill 2279.
Senator Nelson.
Mr. President, I live in probably the district with the largest population of gay people. They are my constituents. They don't come out and say, hey, I'm gay, you know, give me this, give me that, whatever. They are caring people in our community. And quite frankly, I see 2279 as a bill to allow all of our citizens to advance towards their American dream. This is a bill that truly states North Dakota values, respect and acceptance of all our people, regardless of who they love. This bill affects employment, public accommodations or services, credit transactions, sales and rentals, brokerage services. There's even an exclusion for religious and private clubs. It also includes insurance and jury service. There are currently 21 states in the District of Columbia that have total non-discrimination policies. Add to that over 200 cities and counties and many Fortune 1000 companies and American 200 law firms that have similar policies. In the past 10 years, major businesses have gone from 13 to 366, with scores of 100 from the Human Rights Commission. And many of those companies do operate here in North Dakota. What Senate Bill 2279 does is extend the basic protections in home and workplace to members of the LGBT community in North Dakota by including sexual orientation to the North Dakota Fair Housing Act and the North Dakota Human Rights Act. The people this legislation is designed to protect from losing their jobs or being evicted from their homes because they are gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender, are our children, our sons, our daughters, our brothers, our sisters. They are folks we work with and the worshipers we sit next to in the pews on Sunday. They are our friends and our families. They are people that we love. There's a reason that 90% of the Fortune 500 companies include sexual orientation as the protected class in their company's handbooks. They want to be successful. They want to employ the best and the brightest, no matter what their sexual orientation. As one large healthcare business in this state commented, it's just plain good business. This legislation will serve to increase the state's ability to attract, retain, and expand its pool of talented workers. We want to encourage our young people to stay, and many of them desire caring, inclusive, and diverse communities. This will head us in the right direction. You know, in January 27th, the Mormon Church started a campaign for new laws that protect our LGBT people. Last year, the current leader of the Catholic Church said, "Who are we to judge? Discrimination is judgment." Martin Luther King said, "The time is always right to do what's right." And I encourage you to do what's right and vote green on 2279.
Is there any further discussion? Senator Obam.
Thank you, Mr. President. In my short time here, I've come to gain a whole lot of respect for this chamber and everybody in it. I respect your work, your life experiences, the issues on which we agree, and the issues on which we disagree. I respect the communities and the constituents we serve, and I have a recently newfound respect for how each of us get here, and the desks we sit in and the people we represent from these seats. Perhaps my sitting next to you and being a senator at all speaks a bit to how much times are changing on certain issues. This bill in front of you and the decision we're about to make on it is pretty simple. It's not a partisan issue. There will be Republicans and Democrats who will support it. It's not a geographical issue. There will be rural and urban senators from each side of the state and the places in between who will support it. It's not a generational issue. There will be senators, some brand new and some long-serving, some young, and some maybe a bit more seasoned, who will support it. It's not an issue that even requires political courage, because the majority of North Dakotans support it. This bill doesn't create a protected class any more than it does for race or color or religion or sex or age, because we all have a sexual orientation. Mine happens to be heterosexual, and that will be protected just as much as anybody with a different sexual orientation will be protected. If it passes and I go to work for my very successful business owner friend who happens to be gay, he could no longer fire me just for being straight. We don't often think about it like that because we don't have to. He should, however, fire me because I would be woefully unprepared to do his work. This bill is not a religious issue. As a proud piano-playing Christian in my church, I certainly respect matters of faith. But I also respect North Dakota law, which holds that we can't be discriminated against, nor discriminate against others because of our faith. I don't have to be Jewish or believe in the Jewish faith or have any religion at all to understand that discrimination against somebody who is Jewish is wrong. Plain and simple, this bill is about making a change in policy. You don't have to have a change of heart or mind. Either we believe it's okay under the law to fire people from their jobs or kick them out of their apartments for who they are, or we don't. Whether or not you feel being LGBT is right or wrong is actually irrelevant. Mr. President, this is about our people. Your friends, your kids' friends, somebody's sibling or nephew or grandchild, our past, present, and future students, or coworkers, or legislative colleagues, anyone who calls North Dakota home. LGBT people and those who love them are our constituents in Fargo and in Fessenden, in Bowman, and in Bismarck. LGBT people are North Dakotans. They deserve to be treated under the law exactly the same, not better and not worse, as you and I are. I'd respectfully request a yes vote to extend to all North Dakotans the same respect I've come to have and will continue to have for all of you.
Senator Sorvog.
Mr. President, I have a question for the carrier. We've heard some discussion here about all these large businesses, and they all have large human services department. They all have multiple training, but we got a whole lot of really small businesses in this state. I own one, and we have people multitasking. We have, most of us in small probably printed our applications for new employees off the internet. And I read the words on here, perceived. And really, how am I supposed to, how are we supposed to do that? Or I have employees that are running machines, that are running errands, that are helping customers. If they make a mistake and the person feels they perceived them to be something different than what they are, I'll be sued. That's happening all over the country, and it's bankrupting a lot of small businesses. And my question to the carrier, was this part of the discussion, or is the customer-business relationship protected, or has no bearing? I know it does in the job, but if a client, somebody walks in, and I don't want to do a job for them for multiple reasons, am I going to be sued because they perceived that I might have discriminated, when we turn customers down all the time because their projects don't make sense? So I guess, was there any discussion on this issue, especially related to small businesses?
Senator Hogue, care to respond?
Yes, Mr. President, I will attempt to respond. The perception relates to the perception that the employer has of the employee, or the person who's applying for credit, or the person who is a tenant in a apartment complex, or the person who is seeking public accommodations. That perception is the one that matters. And yes, the committee did discuss this, and this is one of the fundamental problems with this bill. It's not a change from the last session, and this is something that we pointed out in the last session. You get to litigate based on whether or not somebody thinks you might be gay. That's part of the problem. And it's here again, and it hasn't been changed. And to further respond to the question, Mr. President, we talked about that perception issue, yet we didn't find anybody who could say that they discriminated against an employee or an employer. And maybe that's because we have such low unemployment in this state. I'd happen to practice in the area of employment law, and I've just never encountered a single employer, large or small, who cared about race, gender, sexual orientation. They just want somebody to show up on time and do their job competently. And in this environment, nobody looks at anything else. But what this act does, it does create a special favor for those people who perceive that they've been discriminated against on the basis of these protected classes. So we talked about it, but the perception relates to that individual and whether the employer who allegedly discriminated perceived what their sexual orientation is or what their gender identity is.
Senator Sorvog.
Mr. President, but I wanted, if you could expand on the question, does this carry over to a customer-retailer example relationship?
Senator Hoag.
Mr. President, the answer is yes. Anybody offering any service or goods to the public is bound by this law. That's the definition of public accommodations.
Senator Schneider.
President, just to offer my two on the legal issue here, I also have a small business, also practice in the area of employment law, and the answer really is simple. As long as you're not discriminating based on your perception of an individual's sexual orientation, you're not going to run afoul of the law. It's just that plain.
Is there any further discussion? Senator Mather.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. The discussion that I've just heard reminds me of a concept we often hear about, and that is, are we dealing with the spirit of the law or the letter of the law? It makes me want to make a telephone call to Pope Francis. Of course, that's not going to be possible. So I'm thinking the law will deal with itself. And it really is a process issue in terms of what actually happens in the specific situations of commerce and how people actually act, and we have laws about that. But I think the discussion I really hear is, what is the spirit of the law? And I think that leads us to vote yes on this bill, 2279.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, the Secretary open the key. Every member register their vote. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change his or her vote? Secretary, close the key and take the tally. Tally reveals 25 senators voting yea, 22 voting nay. Senate Bill 2279 has passed.